Today, I'm joined by Professor Pete Etchells, who is a professor of psychology and science communication. And that's the bit that we're going to start really on focusing. So, A, what does that mean, Pete? And two, why do you do that job? What drew you to this work?
Oh, the what does that mean question is a great one. I started teaching a course on psychological science communication this past year at my uni, and one of the lectures is on that. It's what is science communication, because it's different things to different people, and I think for a lot of people who first get into science communication, um, this is probably a little bit mean of me, but I very often think of what we end up doing is science cheerleading instead.
Mm,
So we get into it because we have a passion and a motivation for science. It's why
yeah.
we're doing this at university, and we want to communicate that to the world and tell everybody about how cool science is. Um, and then you spend a few years doing science, and you realize that it's one of the hardest things, right? It's just constant rejection, constant setbacks, um, these
Yeah.
slight moments of, oh wow, we found something amazing and incredible, but a lot of it is a slog, and I don't think we do a very good job of communicating that.
Unless you're Brian Cox.
Yeah, but I mean, again, it's very different from. So fun fact, I went to the same school as Brian Cox. We had the same physics teacher. Um,
Oh, wow.
I think we have different pressures and different problems in terms of how we communicate different sciences, right?
Mm,
And I think with something like, I don't know, this is where my naivety comes in. With something like physics, I feel like things are a little bit more clear cut, in that you some of the the fundamental stuff out there you don't need to debate as much, but even where the debates are, they're clearly defined in my mind anyway. Maybe that's just because they've got really good science communicators in that area. With something like psychology, it's such a mess, right? Psychology is such a messy discipline because we're studying people, and people are messy, and they do things that you can't predict, and and trying to get in here and try and understanding what's going on inside people's heads. There's no straightforward experimental method to do that, right? So we
mhm.
deal a lot in psychological research, particularly. We deal a lot with uncertainty, but even more so in the communication of that science, or we should do. And I think this is where some of the problems are coming up.
Yeah.
Um, is that we maybe don't do a particularly good job of communicating that uncertainty.
I wonder, my head has just gone in about 20 different directions as you were talking, because I think what you're saying there to anybody that's listening or watching is hard science is easy to communicate because a rock is a rock. And of course, there's different ways to think about a rock or what a rock is or where it is around the world, but a rock is a rock at the end of the day. What we're trying to describe are complicated pathways, complicated development. We're thinking about all the extraneous variables that happen to be a human being. And what I see, and I think the biggest problem in this space at the minute, which is why we're going to get onto your books in a minute, is the clickbait hyperbolic. It's a dopamine pathway, or it's a behavioral addiction, or and we miss out that nuance of what you've just said there, which is human beings are so complicated. And the argument I have the most on the internet, and I get into yeah, the debates, battles, whatever, is when people start to talk about it's a particular pathway. And I say, oh, for God's sake, we are more than a dopamine pathway. We're more than one transmitter. We are multifaceted, multi-complicated, and by the very fact that we're even breathing and alive, our brains change. And this is what I'm seeing in the space at the moment. So let's go straight in on this smartphone thing, because the narrative at the minute is smartphones cause, and I'm doing that in air quotes for those listening, cause mental health issues. And of course, that's a complicated topic in itself. But there is this thing about brain issues, brain development issues. And how do we even have those conversations, which you are extremely good at, actually? So we'll come on to your book in just a second. How do we have those conversations that means the public can understand what the science really says?
Well, it's very kind of you to say that. I'm not sure I am, because I feel like if we were able to have these conversations more, not objectively, but more rationally, more calmly, I think, we would have got there already. And the thing about this is that these conversations have been going on for years and years and years now. One of the reasons that I got into this sort of research and science communication in general is,
Hmm.
I very vividly remember about 12, 13 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, just browsing the news, and I saw a newspaper headline, and it was, computer games leave kids with dementia, one's top neurologist. And
Uh-huh.
I had
I
a
did. Yeah,
background as a
I think
gamer.
I know who you're talking about there.
Yeah, yeah, and it just, you look at that and you go, that. But this is the key, right? So the
Mm.
first thing that happens when you see that, or the first thing that happened to me, is that I went, that doesn't sound right to me, based on what I know about games and a bit of the relevant psychology. So what was happening was that my worldview was being challenged by this headline, and my immediate response was, no, that's not right. And I think that happens to a lot of us, in that, we'll see a headline, and if it fits with what we believe and what we think, then we subsume that into our worldview, and it becomes
Yeah.
part of that. And if it doesn't fit, then we go, no, it's wrong. So I was very much in the, no, that's wrong territory with that headline. And it was Friday afternoon, and we ended up going to the pub after work, and I got into a bit of a rant about this. Say, this is a terrible headline, blah blah blah. And somebody in my department, a professor in the department, was like, "Well, why don't you put your money where your mouth is, Pete, and do some research on this?"
And could that be
Because
why?
I'm sure I was very incoherently arguing why I thought it was a load of rubbish. Because fundamentally, at that point, what it felt like was that it just didn't sit right with what I knew about video games.
Yeah.
And that really kind of started my journey in terms of doing video games research and being interested in digital technology effects. But it also kickstarted my interest in, how do we get this right in terms of science communication? How do
Mhm.
you? So there's a balance there, right? You need to accurately convey the underlying science. And more often than not, you need to do it in the headline and the first few lines of an article, because that's what most people read, if nothing else. But you also need to do it in a way where people actually read it, right? So this is the problem,
Yeah.
that there's lots of good science, good science communication out there. There's lots of good stuff on screens and smartphones and things like that, that not many people read, because it's not the big like attention grabbing scary headline that
Hmm.
that really speaks to the fears that we have.
That, I mean, just going to hold that 1 second, because actually that is the reason why people tend to read something, isn't it? It's the fear. And just with what I've watched on social media over the last 20 something years, the headlines that grab people are the ones generally about health. So those are the ones that people do tend to read, in terms of tomatoes are bad for you. Tomatoes are good for you. Coffee is bad for you. Coffee is good for you. Try a coffee enema, drink it, add this in, ad infinitum. And there is something about, how do you communicate good news? Because what one of the things to say at the minute is, and we'll probably get onto Andy Shabilsky's recent research, which is one of the biggest data sets I've seen in a long time in terms of this space. That's a counter argument to the fear that's being driven at the moment, isn't it? So the fear around smartphones, delay them. I got asked the other day on a radio show about, well, we're going to ban children from buying phones, and I said, but they've never been able to buy them in the first place, because actually the contract belongs to somebody who's an adult, and you have to
Mm-hmm.
be 18. So it's an arbitrary attempt to be seen to be doing something which is moot, because
Mm.
16-year-olds cannot go and buy a phone contract. So what I'm kind of meandering and alluding to here is, so if we go back to the beginning in terms of your video games research, let's start with that. So video games are bad, violent video games, and I know that certainly Chris Ferguson, Andrew Shabilsky, and there's a lot of names in that space that also look at this. One of the things I've talked about in the book that's coming out is, what do we even mean by video games? Because it used to be computer games, video games. Now it's video computer games. There's all the typologies of games. And when we say violent video games, what are we talking about? Because in the early days, when I played Pac-Man and Kong and all of the really early platform games, the fact you're squashing people with a barrel is quite violent. But now we're talking about first person shooters and COD and Hell Let Loose and games like that. So if we go back to what did you find in your early research around the games, etc., etc.? And I am just going to do this thing where I go, that's one of your books. So that's the lost in a good game and the why we play video games, computer games, or whatever we're going to
Mm.
use in the nomenclature. So what did you find out about humans and video gaming, and what did that then do in terms of that counter argument? Because I think the person you're talking about there, she's had quite an influence in this space.
Yeah, I guess so. Maybe not so much nowadays, but certainly 10, 15 years ago. So the interesting thing there, I guess, is that that headline was about, if you play a game, does it cause cognitive deficits? Does it cause early onset dementia in kids, right? So there's no evidence. There is still no
Nope.
research that shows that that's the case. Although there's a fun story about that. We'll maybe get onto it a bit. There's a paper that came out in 2015 that seemed to kind of tie into that. And it was very much picked up in the news as Call of Duty causes Alzheimer's in gamers, and I think that was I think it might have been in the press release, possibly.
Mm.
It was a paper that tested neither Call of Duty nor Alzheimer's. So
Well, I
how
mean
do you get
that's
to that then?
yeah, that we can pick up because there's one that I can counter in the space of the ledger of harms that are listed
Mm.
for social media.
But to go to the question that you're asking, so the professor said, why don't you put your money where your mouth is and do some research on this? So you'd think that I'd go into that area, right, looking at the potential kind of cognitive effects of games. But what very quickly happened was we gravitated towards this whole question around violent video games and whether they cause aggression or not. So that's where my research focused for a few years. And I think there's an important take-home message there, because part of the reason that happened was, well, because that was the biggest debate that was going on,
Hmm.
certainly in kind of the public sphere and people's general worries about games. It always gravitated towards violent games killing kids, basically. Um, and the other is related, is that 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 question, that research on that topic dominates, or dominated at the time, video games research. And it's one of the points that I made in Lost in a Good Game, was that because what's going on is that everybody's worried that these things are bad for us, bad for kids, and they grab our attention, they grab our headlines, and what you then get is sort of psychologists, media effects researchers gravitating towards that.
Yep.
It effectively sucks all the oxygen out of the room for doing other research. So I remember when Lost in a Good Game came out, and I did a fair few talks around it. And I always got great questions at the end. So people asking really insightful questions around, and a lot of them were around, okay, so you talked about violent games and aggression. What about this question? Has anybody done any research on this thing? And I remember getting into being very aware that people were asking me these questions at different talks. And my stock answer was, that's a really great question. I'm going to remember that and try and do some research on it, because it's a great
Hmm.
question. I don't know, because nobody's done any work on it. And this was the major problem, that everybody ended up getting focused. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people ended up getting focused on this violent video games question. And it was a very vitriolic error. I think it still is.
Yeah,
In my mind, that it's not something to worry about now. The bet we've got good evidence now that
yep.
violent video games, yes, there may be small associations with aggressive behaviors, but they're short-lived, and there's certainly nothing to worry about on the sort of societal violence levels that we initially worried about them. I am absolutely certain that there are researchers on the other side of that debate who would very much disagree with me on that, but it's
I think
okay.
they might. I think they might be the ones that have come up with the general aggression model.
Yeah, but I
Yeah.
mean, I understand that. Yeah, you kind of get into an area of research, and if you develop theories that you effectively attach your career to, I totally understand how it's very difficult to let go of those. It's it's just part of human nature. We don't like being wrong, right? But
Can I
to my
give
mind,
you
that debate's largely settled. But we're still in this situation where we've got this very big void. There are lots of really fundamental questions around how video games impact us and how they interact with things like our well-being. They were just not really answered because we were focused on other things.
Can I give you a really funny example? And it was another one of those where my I was with my eldest son, and we'd gone to see Gunter von Hagen's exhibition down in London. And as we walked in, there was a video playing, and it was Bushman. And the video was talking about violent video games and boys and what it was actually creating in males. And I was sitting there thinking, and my son was like, "What's going on?" Because I stood in front of this screen having an abdab, kind of like, "What is he talking about?" And then I went, "How ironic," because to my left was one of the exhibitions of Gunter von Hagen, who's the person who did the plastification of bodies, and
Hmm.
here was a body that he'd taken a cadaver. He'd done all this miraculous work on it to make it an artistic sculpture. So there was half a body in pieces, separated out. And I'm looking at the screen going, so violent video games. And here I am looking at what could be interpreted as body violence done for an artistic format. How are we even having this contradiction? So
Mm.
when I see the conversations that come out from like Anderson and Bushman and what's really going on in terms of their violent video games equals real world violence, which I know has been contested by yourself, Andy Shabilsky, certainly Pat Markey and Chris Ferguson did a book on this and talked about the findings around real world violence and
Hmm.
video games, that there is this huge contradiction, exactly what you're talking to here, which is even when we have the evidence that says, well, not really, we can't actually show that, we can't prove it. So why do we get this so wrong? And I know that the answer really is attributional bias and cognitive bias, and it's being a human. So why do you think we get this so wrong in the media and the conversations that we're having?
I remember being in I can't remember what specifically it was. I think it might have been a talk at the Royal Institution, probably about 10, 12 years ago, and it was around. It was at the start of the replication crisis in psychology, but it was more around how scientists interact with the media. Um, and it was super interesting. There were all sorts of scientists in the room. There were all sorts of journalists in the room, and it got quite heated. Because the basis of that meeting was basically um, a group of scientists who were getting increasingly irked that the way that research was being represented in the media wasn't right, and this was the fault of journalists. And the
Mhm.
journalists were saying, actually, we do read papers. We don't just read the press releases. The press releases are wrong. And it's not just us. It's if you're a scientist and you write a paper where I don't know, you I don't know, you get a petri dish with some cancer cells in it, and you stick some bleach in it, and it kills the cancer cells. And then in your discussion section, right at the end, you say, and this has potential therapeutic treatments for human cancer. That's the thing that will get picked up.
Yes.
Is that wrong? Well, no, because you said it as the scientist, right? It's in your paper, you wrote it. So this goes both ways, right? But one of the things that really stuck with me there was there's a brilliant science journalist, science writer called Ed Yong, who
Yeah.
was based in the UK at the time, and had this. I remember this diagram that he had. He's like basically like summarizing what was going on in the situation. That you've got a good scientist here talking to good journalists and getting annoyed with each other about how to fix this thing, and then there are bad scientists and bad journalists, and they're not even in the room because they don't care.
Yep.
And this is the trouble, right? That you can communicate science as accurately as possible, but it's always possible that somebody can come along with a bad study, basically, a study that looks as though it shows something, but when you really scratch away at what they've done, they're not showing that at all. But the top line finding is thing bad or thing good, whatever it is, a very easy to digest
Yeah.
finding, and obviously that's going to get picked up. not necessarily uncritically, but picked up in the news as scientists say thing bad, thing good, and that's an easy thing to digest.
Hmm.
And we see this all the time. So it's one of the big things that I really struggled with my new book, Unlocked, actually, was that I read articles or I read pop science books where there's this big idea that this is one trick that from psychology that can change your life, or really kind of captivating, really well written stuff. It's good.
Hmm.
There's a lot of good reads out of there that are based on rubbish science. And there'll be a paper in there that they talk about, and they'll say, in this amazing paper, and a really kind of eloquent description of what they did, and a really kind of clear finding, and this is how it supports my big theory of everything type thing. And what I found very frequently in writing Unlocked, in all sorts of different topics, because it covers lots of different things. It's not just mental health. It covers sleep and attention and addiction and things like that.
Yeah.
I go, that's concerning for me. Here's a paper that looks as though it's completely arguing against what I'm trying to say here. Okay, I need to go read it. And I'd spend a day or 2 days reading one paper and just getting completely lost in it because
Oh, good. It
a
wasn't just it
what
wasn't just you then.
oh no, it happens all the time. That you read a paper, and a what how it's reported, be
Yeah.
that in an article or a book or whatever, is not what they've done. But a lot of the times I found that even what's going on in the paper doesn't make sense. Like you read the abstract, particularly. So there's a chapter on like blue light from screens and how does that
Yep.
impact sleep. And there are papers out there in that area that in the abstract, you read it and you just read the abstract, and the take home message is that our study shows that blue light from screens impacts sleep. You look at the data in the same paper, like you look at the results section, you look at the data, and they don't show that. They just don't show it. Like it's it's
Yeah.
it's almost like somebody's gone, I want this to be a thing, so I'm going to do this study, and the data don't show that, but I'm going to pretend like that's not the case, and I'm going to write it up as if
Hmm.
it's not, and it gets through peer review, and it's just incredible. And I very frequently remember sitting there writing Unlocked, just reading a paper and having to talk to sort of friends and colleagues and say, look, can you just read this paper a second, because I think I'm losing the plot, because this isn't showing what they're saying it's showing, and everybody's saying that this is what it is. And you see this constantly, right? And it's not even that the paper has to be bad. There are good, really interesting papers out there that are just misrepresented. And there's a really great example of that at the minute, the Norwegian smartphone ban paper,
That didn't
right?
actually ban smartphones.
Yeah.
That
So
one. Yes.
this, I think, is a really good example of how science communication is going wrong at the
Yeah.
minute, because that paper, and actually, I'm not trashing that paper. There's lots of good things to say about that paper. It's great that people are trying to do research of that type. I don't think it's perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, that aside, you look at the title, you look at the abstract, and it sort of suggests that here's some data that shows that after schools implement smartphone bans, you see reductions in the bad stuff. Basically, is how it's taken, and you see people going, this is the evidence that we need it, right? This shows very clearly that smartphone bans
Yeah.
work.
Well, that's on
And
social
everybody,
media.
everybody was chatting about it, right? Because it's got that clear, simple message. Right?
Hmm.
Um, I read that paper and it's like, literally within like 5 minutes of starting to read it, I'm not being egotistical saying that. I'm saying that it doesn't even require you to read the entire paper. I'm just not convinced that many people read that paper. Um,
I'm not
I'm
convinced people read them
certainly
anyway.
convinced. Well, yeah, I mean,
It's-
I'm certainly not past the abstracts, but I think most people just didn't read it and just took it as somebody said that this paper shows that smartphone bans work, so I'm gonna take that as a given. You look at like how they defined smartphone ban. I think there were like 500 schools in that study, and more than 50% of them, a smartphone ban is defined as put your phone on silent during class. It's like it's not a ban. That's not a smartphone ban, right? If you ask people what a smartphone ban is, they don't say that. They say phones not in schools or phones in lockers as soon as you go to school.
yes.
It's not.
Well, that's going to bring us to the. Oh, let's go down this route. Why not? So Miriam Cates has recently been, I think we could just do each topic in your book here in terms of, so Miriam Cates has just recently regurgitated Jonathan Haidt's book at Westminster. It was torturous to listen to because there was a lot of grandiosity and the smartphone bans. Actually, the DfE provided some evidence about this for schools. Obviously, because I work in schools, I've got to be up to date on all of the new DfE guidance in safeguarding and so on. And what it pretty much said was it's down to each school. Each school can implement a don't bring them in, or put them in a locker, or turn them on to silent, or put them in your bag, etc., etc. But also, as part of that guidance, one of the lines said, but we understand that year 11s, certainly year 13s, it might have been. So the 12s and 13s. So these are, if you are in a high school and you've got 2 years, 12 and 13, that are doing their A levels within that environment, they're allowed phones. So how is that going to work, especially when, and I've got clients who are, they have medical issues, so their smartphones are tied to their smart watches because of
Yep.
critical issues around epilepsy, heart problems, and other things. I'm just being careful not to identify. And there is this thing about you can't take a smartphone away if somebody's got a smart watch. And even the debate that's happening on social media is, oh, children's attention has changed completely, and they're, they can't even focus like a goldfish. And all these big, again, hyperbolic statements in all of the schools I've worked in for the last 15 years. This idea of smartphones, children are not on them all the time. There might be a moment where a child who is a young carer gets a message from mum saying, I'm just taking your dad off to the doctors, or can you come home and keep an eye on your little sibling because I've got to go into hospital. Those
Yeah.
children are using smartphones in a different way for different reasons.
Hmm.
So, going back to your smartphone ban piece of research, what I'm seeing regurgitated and pontificated on social media at the moment is, well, this happened over in this country, or this happened here. And actually, this is what we're now going to implement as a school. And I'm like, where's the practicality? How are you actually going to do this practically?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing to say as well is that the whole debate in the UK is predicated on this sort of unspoken assumption that nothing's happening in schools at the minute. And like you say, like schools already have rules and regulations in place, right, and
Yeah.
have done for a long time.
Yep.
This is not something new for schools. There is a lot of variability in that, but I think that also reflects in that you can't have a one size fits all. We certainly can't have a one size fits all solution for individual kids, but I don't
Mhm.
think you can even have it for schools or local school authorities and things like that. There are different needs and different pressures in different areas and different types of schools and things like that. And all of that gets lost in this because it feels as though um, there's a very clear, very immediate problem or danger going on, and there's therefore this sort of sense of urgency that we need to do something right here, right now to fix it. And I understand that, like if you kind of buy into that, and you get taken by that sort of viewpoint, that it does feel like we need to do something right here, right now. And it's very difficult to push back against that as a science communicator, because what you get on the other side is, researchers and communicators saying, well, look, the evidence isn't there yet.
Mhm.
We need to do more research on this. And then what starts to happen is that you get this sort of us versus them setup, which is you have people who want to put a ban in now because fundamentally they care about the kids, right? And they want things to improve for kids. And
Yeah.
then on the other side, you have scientists sitting in their ivory tower, completely detached from reality, and all they care about is data. And that's all well and good for them to do that, but data doesn't map onto reality, right?
No.
Data's a spreadsheet, right? And people are real things. And to my mind, it couldn't be further from the truth, right? Big data, thinking about evidence, maps very immediately, very directly on to people's lives, right? And we need it, right?
Mhm.
Because we need to understand what works and what doesn't, so that we can put in the right sorts of fixes. So I've been sort of trying to say this a lot, that I I mean, I'm not like 100% against bans depending on what your definition of a ban is, as long as there's evidence for it. You know, I've said this a lot on kind of radio shows and stuff recently. You know, I've got a 4-year-old daughter, and
Mhm.
she's not going to have a smartphone for as long as possible. We're in a really privileged position there because, you know, she doesn't have any medical needs or caring needs, so we can afford to say that, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that she's not going to have one because they're evil or they're addictive or things like that. It's that I don't see a need there at the minute. We don't, as a family, see that particular need. But again, that's a very personal circumstance for us, and I wouldn't be able to say that in a different situation
Yeah,
necessarily.
yeah, certainly I'm hearing balance. The fact that at the moment that would be entertainment. Certainly for a 4-year-old, it's entertainment purposes. It's not
It's
socializing
TV
purposes.
basically.
Yeah, but there's also so my children are a lot older than yours. They're actually in their late 20s. And there is something about I've watched them grow up and all of the children that I've worked with over the many years. Internet Matters, when I was writing for the Gordon Bennett, when was that? So that might be about 2010, 20. It's in the Jonathan Haidt era, so I'm going to be careful of how I frame this. Children around about 10 to 11 are the age at which they tend to get smartphones. And my career is working with children who are harmed by things that happen, and I'm going to make this very specific, in social media, not because of social media.
Hmm.
So it's
Hmm.
the people who are there, the processes that people engage in through technology. And I'm not saying we shouldn't, we shouldn't try and protect children whatsoever. Sadly, the internet was created and the smartphone coming out in 2007. For me, there's something about, okay, even before the smartphone, and this is one of the things that Jonathan Haidt hasn't really covered, is going all the way back to those flip phones that he talks about being, well, they were okay because when you had flip phones, there was nothing there. I can tell you the reason I look at cyber trauma is because my eldest child was in the yard with somebody who had a flip phone, and the video that was on the flip phone was of somebody being beheaded. This is going all the way back to 2009. So what's being
Hmm.
spoken about now is not new. It's more prevalent, or it's being spoken about more, or we're having more discussions about it. But flip phones were not safe. And I saw Miriam
Hmm.
Cates say in Parliament, "We'll just give them a phone where they can text." And I'm like, do you understand how child sexual abuse occurs? Do you understand how messaging apps are the same thing as texting apps? And the fact that you can have a phone that allows text probably means that there's a way that you could share files, etc., as we used to do with Bluetooth.
Hmm.
So there is no protection by giving them a what they're now calling dumb phones, or brick phones. So we're not getting anywhere by saying take the smartphone away and give them a dumb phone, because the harms are still going to happen, and
Yeah.
children have access to the internet. So there's something here about your approach is to protect from the harms for as long as is possible. And then comes a time when your child is going to be using those spaces where there might be forums and chat rooms and Google Docs or whatever it is that we're doing, plus the VR environment, which we're probably not going to cover today too much. But children are moving into an environment where smartphones are going to become less than popular. So
Yeah.
even if we do ban them, we're not going to resolve the problem, because what we're not addressing is how do we educate and prepare. I think that's, for me,
Yeah.
that's the biggest crux. And every time I get asked about, so what should we be doing? Media literacy. Media
Yeah.
literacy.
Yeah.
That's where I think, personally and professionally, that's where I think we need to be. And I'm going to be careful that I don't parent blame here, but actually the e-safety sector has been for 14, 15 years inviting parents to come in and gain media literacy skills for their children, and parents haven't turned up to those meetings. And
Mm.
now we're in a space where we're going, oh, we let them roam into the woods and they're now being, I don't know, savaged by bears and wolves, and oh, just ban
Mm.
the woods.
It's hard being a parent, isn't it? It's
Without a
really
doubt.
hard, and I think one of the problems here is, yeah. So I seen like recently some people who are very kind of pro ban, um, it kind of feels like a mask has slipped a little bit in the way that they talk about this, and there's sort of been this shift in rhetoric saying that this we should be talking to kids about this sort of stuff, and we shouldn't be berating them, things like that. We should be berating the parents, and I'm like, I don't think we should be berating anybody in this situation. Everybody, well, not everybody, but most people are like trying to do the right thing, right?
Yeah.
And there are so many pressures on people's lives, and it's not just this, that you get expectations as a parent about, in terms of
Uh-huh.
you need to know everything that there is to know about this particular thing to help your kid. And that's in education and health and online safety and all those sorts of things, and there's only so much time in the day. So it doesn't surprise me that there's been low engagement there. There's for me, there's all this thing, there's as well, that the iPhone appeared in 2007, and what happened was that we got them, and we got them because they were cool, right?
Mhm.
We didn't really think about why we were going to use them or what our goals were, and we just kind of winged it. And for some of us that worked well. For some of us that ended up really bad. Some really bad
Yeah.
situations happen. And I think what's happening now is that same thing's happening for kids now. There are media literacy, digital literacy programs out there.
Yep.
There's nothing that's particularly joined up. There's certainly no kind of national program. And I think if government were to step in and do something about this, it's there that I'd like them to see to do something, rather than sort of top line bans. But you talk to kids, talk to teenagers, and they're aware that those things are out there, but they're not using them. And ultimately, what they're doing then is the same thing that we did when we got our iPhones and Android phones for the first time, is that they're winging it too. So it's not random completely, but it's anybody's guess as to what path you end up going down in terms of benefits and risks and harms. And I think that's the thing, is like, even if there was incontrovertible evidence that
Mhm.
a smartphone ban from 16 onwards works, it really fixes all the things that you want to fix it. Even in that situation, you don't want to just enact a ban on its own. You want to build those digital literacy skills,
Yes.
because essentially what's happening there is you're saying that there comes a point where actually we don't care what happens anymore, and it's just we're trying to push that as far as possible. Just putting in a ban and giving a 16-year-old a phone doesn't magically equip them with the skills to navigate that online
Yeah.
environment, right? They're still going to come across potentially harmful stuff, things that they find uncomfortable. What we need to do between now and then is build resiliency skills in them, help them build support networks. That might be within their families, but very often it will be not. And it's trying to figuring
Mhm.
out what that sort of support network looks like for that particular child, so that if they do come across problematic content once they're out of the ban era, um, they can talk to people about it, and they've got some way of dealing with it, so that it doesn't
Mm.
lead to further harm.
Mm.
And we're not really having those conversations. We're certainly not
No,
having those
no.
conversations at a national level.
So that's for me, that's where my kind of social media activism and kind of throwing videos out at the moment is coming from,
Mm,
because for the last certainly 10 years, parents are time poor. And I totally get this in terms of working with the children and the families. The parents are often in positions where we now have a higher level of certainly single parent families and separated families. And of course, if mum is trying to outdo dad and dad is trying to outdo mum, there's usually more than one technological device at
mm,
each household, and the way that the parents deal with it is different per parent, and it's a bit of a mess. But also, parents are time poor, they're technologically afraid. I suspect children who are should I say adults who are the age of my children, so like the late 20s, are probably aware of what the internet is because they've grown up with it. And certainly that's what I find on the videos that I've made about gaming and things like that. Young people coming in going, "Where were you 10 years ago? Where were you?"
yeah.
So that I could educate my parents in this. And at times, I kind of go, "Yeah, Kath for the win with her parenting around gaming and so on, and understanding the environment." But the parents I work with don't, and it's
Mm,
not because they're ignorant. It's because it's this environment you can't see. And
yeah.
what one of the things I've found is government tends to go, well, education, it's your role. Education says to the parents, we're going to give you some helpful tips. And the parents go, don't tell me how to parent.
Mm,
Parents want to parent in their own way. And unfortunately, those people in the middle, the perpetrators of crimes against children and the harmful material, they sit in the middle, and that's where the children are. And then, of course, you say to kids, right, so we're going to give you some e-safety lessons. And the eyes roll as far back as
Mm,
last week. And they go, oh, I know not to give my name and number out online and da 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 da. But we're not giving the skills around gaming environments. I don't see that
yeah,
appearing in education. I don't see conversations around here's what to do when. And then we get to the industry level, which is, and the children in my office tell me they report and nothing happens. They don't get any feedback.
yeah,
Nobody follows up with it. Police are overrun, so the law enforcement systems can't deal with what's coming in terms of the issues. We've got cybercrime, we've got other forms of crime, and the children are saying, "So where do we go?
yeah.
Who do I report this to, and how do I deal with this?" And that for me is the human technology gap, which is why I'm kind of interviewing people like yourself
Mm,
to say, okay, how do we do this? Because your book is absolutely wonderful at going through, here's the science, here's what we really know about blue light, here's what we know about sleep. I've pretty much bunny hopped over this because I kind of talk about it a lot in the therapy office, and I certainly didn't go deep into the science because pretty much one of the chapters is I don't understand some of this research because they're using tests that I've never trained in. I don't know how to read this report. Um,
mm,
I can do quant and qual because that was part of my training, and I'm obviously at PhD level, but the average person in the public just wants to know what's the headline.
yeah.
So, can we go through your book in terms of, and for people that don't have it, do go get it. And it's you're unlocked. There is a number of chapters here where you've talked about what the science really says. So if we go through, and you've mentioned some of them so far, light and sleep. So one of
Mhm,
the things I cover in my book is dieting because of my functional health background, because I also see the link between gaming equals obesity. Not necessarily true because there's all the exergames and again, it's that balanced approach. So, if you could do your book in headline format, what would it really be?
So what I tried to do with the book is, because it was very much about general screen time. Obviously, like, the conversation shifted more towards social media specifically.
Mm,
In the Even in the past month, it's really kind of narrowed in on that. But trying to go through things that I've seen over the past 10, 15 years that people really worry about and just crop up consistently in the news. What's the evidence behind them? Are they things that we actually should be worried about, or are there different ways of thinking about them, or are there other questions underneath that actually, don't worry about this particular thing that people try and scare you about, but this is a thing that we should really, be thinking
mhm.
about. Um, so there's a couple of chapters on social media and mental health, or screen time and mental health, and obviously that's where the conversation is dominating at the minute. I guess as a sort of take home message, the thing that I try and get across there really is that what it feels like we're trying to do in that debate at the minute is go, okay, adolescent mental health, what is it doing? It looks like it's going down. If that's the case, what's causing that? And the whole debate is framed around what's trying to find what the biggest causal factor is,
Yeah.
right? Because then you identify that, you can fix it, you get rid of that, and then you don't fix everything, but that's a big chunk of stuff going. And the point that I try and make in the book is that that's the wrong way of thinking about this. I think if you try and do that, you will always be doomed to failure, because you'll get stuck in conversations around, well, how do you define this thing? What is the impact? Well, some studies say that there's this, it's definitely this, and some studies say it's definitely not this. And it's entirely, literally, the conversation that we're stuck in at the minute.
Mhm.
Um, so the framing that I think is a bit more sensible. It doesn't give you an easy answer. Nothing does in this stuff, right? But
And
a
that's
better
not the
way of
answer
trying to
people want.
no, but
That's not what.
it's so it's the idea that online risk mirrors offline risk. Our online lives generally mirror our online offline lives. That they are more connected than we probably think they are, and that rather than thinking of whether social media or screen time or smartphones or whatever operational definition you want to use, is the sole cause of mental ill health, or the root cause, or the main driver. To start thinking about this in terms of, well, our phones and social media, they're a lens basically through which things like pre-existing vulnerabilities, or even just our day-to-day mood and situational factors,
Yeah.
those things are either intensified or they're dampened down depending on what's going on at
Yep.
that
Yep. Yep.
particular moment. So getting rid of it or not getting rid of it is sort of the wrong way of thinking about it. Social media, it's one factor in this sort of ecosystem of interacting factors that either promote resilience or dampen it down, really. And then there's a chapter on sleep that starts off with that really focused on blue light, because I think a lot of people are worried about this. And I think one of the common themes that I found through the book is, when there are things that we worry about, particularly around human psychology and behavioral things that we do, we very often have a tendency to try and look for biological explanations.
Yeah.
So with the sleep thing, we're worried about kids not getting enough sleep at night, and we worry that phones are impacting that. So the first thing that happens there is that we try and find a biological reason why that might be the case. And the biological argument there is that screens emit blue light. Blue light inhibits impacts on melatonin production, and therefore you've got this sort of direct biological effect. Now, blue light does have a very strong effect on sleep-wake cycles. That's not up for discussion or debate. That's very clear. What's not clear is whether the amount that you get from phones has a meaningful impact. And again, it's the sort of take home. I'm basically spoiling my entire book here, aren't I? The take home message there is that, I think there are problems with kids and sleep, and digital tech has a role to play in that. But it's not. I don't
Yeah.
think
It's
if
not
you,
down.
you stick
Yeah.
you stick night shift mode on, it's not going to do anything. The problem is the interaction elements, right? The social norms that have developed around kids being expected to be on their phones at like 10 o'clock at night, because that's when there's a real uptick in social activity, and they're having to get up earlier in the day because of school pressures on the other side, and that
Yeah.
that window of opportunity for sleep necessarily gets narrowed. So for me there, it's not thinking about like banning phones or getting rid of social media, or changing your screen so it's grayscale or yellow or something
Uh,
like that. It's
mm.
thinking about how do we change how we view those expectations about wanting to be online at that point in the evening.
Oh, but there's some tripe out there, Pete, in terms of so this blue light debate. So my background from the army is optronics, so I had to study light and eyes and so on, and I have a real fascination with this thing. I can tell you that I was dealing with sleep issues in adults way before people were using technology in the way they do, and I've got to use
Mhm.
glasses because I've used computers for such a long time that my glasses actually have a glaze on to prevent the blue light affecting the rods and cones at the back.
Mhm.
That's all eye science, but we'll leave that to the side.
Doesn't work,
And
by the way.
and
There's no
well, I mean the
evidence.
thing
So
that
I've got the same. I've got the same on these. There's an anecdote in the book about it,
yeah,
where I was talking to like a sleep specialist, and I was like, I don't. I was just like an offhanded remark about like, oh, I've got this blue light filter on my glasses, and he's like, yeah, they don't work.
yeah.
And I was like,
Well,
oh, great. And then there was a Cochrane review that came out in December that basically confirmed that. So, um,
and the space I've seen this in the most, and this is going to go back to that replication crisis that you were talking about earlier, and social media and the conveyance of information. So there is a very, very there's quite a few famous podcasters and so on in this space. And
mm,
certainly, I have frequented because of my health training. I've been in the spaces of what are known as air quotes biohackers, and
right.
there has been a huge market in terms of, and I won't name them here, certain medical doctors who were pushing for red light therapies, which we know have evidence behind, which we know. I'm doing that thing like I'm part of the community again. But there is this thing about red light has health benefits. So on the opposite end of the spectrum, and I watched, and even the safety sector ran into this. So blue light this, blue light that. And I said, do you actually know
Mm,
how eyes work? where they don't filter out a specific wavelength of blue light. They can be affected by blue light, but your eyes do not go, "Oh, no, I'm not having, the other 3 spectrums. I'm not taking those in.
Yeah.
No green, no red, no yellow, not today." And what I do find is actually the people who have had the sleep problems in terms of being in my clinic are people who are ruminating, people who might have, anxiety, depression, and it's those kind of processes that then lead them to, now technology exists, picking up the device or doing something
Yeah.
with it. And it's this idea of the other side of things that you haven't covered in your book, but I do find that this is another prevalent narrative on social media, is the EMF that's given out by these devices by having them in your room and under your pillow and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Again, we've got to get this science really correct, I suppose, in the way
Mm.
that we educate people around it. And I'm thinking, even your conversation, just having that little snippet of there's no arguing about blue light does have an impact. Oh, well,
Mm.
there you are then. We'll create some glasses, we'll create some filters, we'll create some, I don't know, whatever it is, commercial products that we can then sell. And then what we'll do is we'll go on the biggest podcasts that exist. We'll sell our snake oil interventions. And then what happens is that kind of comes down in a tertiary level, doesn't it? And then suddenly now we're all saying blue light affects you and don't have them in your bedrooms.
Yeah, yeah, and I think so. One of the biggest take homes for me from talking to sleep experts for the book was this idea, and you kind of mentioned it, this idea of rumination. That the thing that's really going to drastically impact your sleep is the kind of expectations that you develop around sleep practices. So
Yeah.
I was talking to a clinician who was saying that he has patients that come in, and they'll say, like, they start walking to bed, and they're absolutely shattered and really ready for a good night's sleep, and then they'll go into the bedroom and they'll see their bed, and as soon as they see their bed, that's it.
Yep.
They're awake, they're wide awake, because they've developed these associations with it that are really maladaptive. And it's like an absolute red flag that, and they've got really severe problems with insomnia. And
Mhm.
there are all sorts of reasons why you might develop those sorts of really negative sleep associations, and that they can be hard to break, but they can be broken. Now, where all this starts to get a little bit trickier and a bit muddier is, what's the role of digital technology in that? So the point they're trying to make in the book is that, strictly speaking, in terms of, you talk to any sleep specialist and you talk about good sleep hygiene,
Mhm.
bedrooms need to be really dark, really quiet, really cool. Um, you only use your bed for sleep and sex, basically. Don't
Yeah.
do anything else in
Or
bed,
reading
because
books.
well, no, even that, because in theory, like, you start doing anything else in bed, like, there's the potential then to start developing poor sleep associations. This is a real problem for, like, university students, right? Because very
Yeah.
often they're in a dorm room where they don't have space to do work anywhere other than on the bed, and you start doing work on your bed. You might start developing kind of stress associations with being on the bed. So what happens in terms of what a lot of us do, which is we go to bed and we go on our phones. It not the basic thing to say there is that, again, you don't want to be doing much other than sleeping in your bed, so try and not do that. But realistically, we all do that. That doesn't mean that you're going to develop bad sleep associations with your phone. It depends what you're doing on it and why.
Mhm.
But a big thing there is to try and be, I don't like using the term mindful for various reasons, but sort of be more reflective of why you're doing, more aware, self-aware of what's going on. That if you find yourself sort of just getting really anxious and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling through Instagram, and you're not doing that for any reason, you've kind of got locked into it. That's probably not a good thing to be doing. If you're reading on your phone or on a Kindle, they're emitting blue light still, but it's probably going to be better for you. There's an anecdote in the book around. So I wrote that chapter when my son was about, like, 6 months old, I think, and we were really struggling with sleep. And I got into a habit of. So I decided I wanted to learn how to do cryptic crosswords. And so I downloaded an app that kind of teaches you how to do it, and then I downloaded another app that's just got thousands of cryptic crosswords on it. And I'd use that. There were times when he was very young that
Mhm.
I needed to stay awake because he was asleep on me, and I can't sleep with a very small child on me. That's really a really dangerous situation to be in. So I'll try and find some way of keeping myself awake. So I do that to kind of occupy my mind. And then later on, when sleep got a little bit better and a little bit more consistent for us, I found that I was using it as a way to relax. So, I go to bed and I do a cryptic crossword, and it just helped me kind of just detach myself from the rest of the day, and it helped me get to sleep. And I finished that chapter by saying, that's what I'm using this app for, and it's okay, but I'm going to be mindful of it or reflective of it. And, if I find myself getting to the point where I'm saying, just one more game, then I'll stop using that app. Now, the coda to that is that after I finished writing the book and it got published, that happened, right? So I caught myself one night and it was like 11:30, going on for midnight, and I was really tired. And I'd already done a crossword, and I was like, oh, I'll just do another one because I'm enjoying this. And I caught myself and I was like, this is the moment, right? This is the point where I feel like this is not helping me now, because it's not, it might be for the first 10 minutes helping me just relax and
Yeah.
unwind to go to sleep. But actually, I've been doing this for an hour and a half now, and that's impacting my sleep. And it was weird in a way, because I find, I don't know whether it's because I'm a psychologist, but I find it very, you kind of come up with these like cognitive tricks, and I find most of them don't work. I'm always
Yeah,
quite
because
quite
you're
stubborn about them.
self-aware of the trick that you're trying
Yeah,
to play. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But this, it wasn't a trick. I was just being very aware of what had happened. And it's almost like I lost the love of it, like almost straight away. So the night after, I was like, I picked up my phone. I was like, I don't really fancy doing a crossword. And then, I don't know, it was like 5, 7 days afterwards, whatever, just deleted the app. And I've like not missed it or anything. So it really did work in that way. And
Well,
it's not a
mm,
magic bullet. It's not a
mhm.
trick or anything like that. It's not going to work for everybody. But I think the point that I was trying to get across was, I mean, there's lots of points there. One is that, was our cryptic crosswords bad for sleep? Is the
You
wrong
should
way
do
of
some
framing that
research on
question, right?
that.
Right, because at one point yes, at another point no, at another point still yes, but for good reasons. So why we use apps and the intentionality behind them is really important. It's something that's not very well captured in research.
So,
You look at this in the kind of the social media mental health question.
yes.
Social, one of the big things in the book is that I say that screen time is a meaningless concept. It doesn't tell you anything useful. But I'd extend that to social media. Social media is an entirely useless concept to talk about,
Yeah,
because
it's
it's
like weather.
so many different things. But it's so many different things to different people at different times, right? So that the way that I use Instagram, for instance, has completely changed over the years that I've used it. I think I don't know why I signed up to begin with. I thought, oh, Instagram, I should probably sign up to it, and didn't use it for a while. And then for a while, I posted just funny video type things. And then for a while, I posted pictures of my cats stuff. And now I'm starting to use it more in a science communication way. And that, like, I've tried to
Yeah.
put some more informative posts up there, like completely different types of use and ways of interacting with it that have changed over time, which make it near on impossible to say, what's the link between Instagram and my mental well-being? Right. And it kind of goes back to that question that I was saying earlier, is like the way that we're framing these questions, I think, is probably the wrong way to think about it.
Certainly, that's the reflection that I would give in the book. And one of the things, and I didn't actually cover it in that book, I generally do it when I'm teaching, is the way that, and it's going back to the sleep one actually, is as a therapist, I usually ask, what is the function of this behavior in this moment for this person? And what
Yeah.
what are the things that kind of drive it? What are the things we could look at? And certainly, and the reason I said books in bed is because I was one of the children that at 11, 12, 13 was under the covers reading the book, when
Hmm.
I'd been told to go to sleep, because I like to take in information.
Yeah.
And I have a curiosity. A lot of that approach in the young people I work with now is the curiosity has been replaced with, but I can take in lots of different forms of
Yeah.
information, and each platform gives its information in a different way, as you were alluding to. But
Yeah.
certainly, the blame and the shame that I'm seeing with breastfeeding mothers who have to get
Mm.
up at whatever time it is in the morning. And quite a lot of my clients, when they've come in, have said, "Do you think I've got a problem, Kath? Because when I'm breastfeeding
Mhm.
my child, I'm playing Tetris or
Mhm.
I'm doing a crossword, like you were talking about there, or I don't know what's one of the other Facebook games. That's usually where I was
Yeah.
talking about it. In terms of the little dual ones and so on." And I said, "Well, does it serve a function in the moment? Yes, it helps me stay awake while I'm feeding the child." Well, then it's not a problem, is it? It's only a
Yeah.
problem when it becomes a problem and you recognize it's a problem. But
Yeah.
what I see, and I don't know if this is kind of the way that I'm trying to convey your book, which I think is really important, is most people have to become aware of that process. And
Yeah.
that being aware, I know you didn't use the word mindful, and I have talked about mindfulness in my upcoming book, is being mindful is usually being self-aware, but
Yeah.
also being compassionate enough with yourself to go, "Oh, I'm doing that thing again.
Yeah.
Oh, I've realized what I'm doing here. Why am I doing this?" And it's
Yeah.
fairly similar to the reasons why people engage in any emotionally driven behavior, such as
Yeah.
eating or going off and doing exercises. Why am I doing this thing in this moment? What is the function that it's serving? And is it a problem right now, or is it a problem overall?
Yeah. And sometimes the answer to that is really hard, right? And
Hmm.
it's a very there's a very deep-seated thing that's going on there that is not going to get fixed in just thinking about it for a bit, for 5 minutes. There are real issues there, and but I think what you were saying there about not feeling kind of guilty or ashamed about it, I think is a really important part of this. So one of the things that I talk about later on in the book is this sort of talk about digital detoxes and some of the nonsense around those. There's a lot of stories about digital detoxes on the internet and in magazines and in books and things like that, and they tend to follow a common theme, which is that person uses technology a lot, something happens, and they have an epiphany that this is a bad thing, and then their solution is to run away and hide in the woods for
Hmm.
a week or a year or forever in some cases. And what I've seen increasingly recently is that there's a sort of sub theme there where it's usually men that do this, and there's some dads there, and they go, um, oh, I was on my phone and my kid was trying to get my attention, and I was ignoring them because I was on my phone, and it's sort of written in a way that makes you feel awful for them because it's such a sort of terrible thing that's happened. And I think we can, if we've got kids, we can relate to that. There's a lot of us that can think
I,
of a
I,
situation where that's happened, and I've been in that
yes.
situation myself with my daughter. And I think a lot of the ways that this conversation is framed, around these things are addictive and they're addicted by design, and this is something that happened to them. When you find yourself in that situation, you feel incredibly bad, right? That
Mhm.
this is something that potentially, I've got a missed opportunity with my kid. My I'm feeling bad that this could potentially be like something that they remember, that I was always on my phone instead of looking at them, and there's a huge amount of shame around it. And one of the things that I try to say in the book is that when you catch yourself in that moment, try not to feel ashamed. Be positive about this in the sense that, well done, you've caught it. If you're actively having those thoughts, you've
Yep.
caught it, and that's the thing that needs to happen if you want to do something about it. And then the next thing is communication, right? So I do this with my daughter, that one of the things that I've been saying a lot recently is, people keep asking me, what are the rules around screens in our household? And I think the thing that I've been saying is that there's no rules for our kids really, because they don't have their own screen tech or anything yet. But the rules, I don't like the word rules. I prefer things like expectations and boundaries because they're a bit more flexible. But they're
Yep.
for us as adults. So we try not to have our phones out at the dinner table, because that's a really good opportunity for us to it would distract the kids from eating, and it's difficult the best of times to get them to eat dinner. But B, it's a chance for us to sort of check in as a family, and we really value that. But and that's true at breakfast, lunch, dinner. Breakfast happens for us around about 7:45, 8ish in the morning. And one of the things that I found recently is that our GP you can't ring them up anymore for
Mhm.
to book an appointment. You've got to go online and fill out a form, and that form appears at 8 o'clock in the morning. And the GP is so overwhelmed at the minute because of pressure on the NHS and
Yeah.
stuff that usually that form shuts by about 8:30 because they're booked out for the day. So you have this very specific window if you want to book an appointment to see a doctor, that if you miss it, you're going to have to wait another day. And I've been in situations where I've missed it multiple days in a row, and it's been like weeks before I've been able to even fill in the form. The problem for us is that that time window is also prime having breakfast and getting the kids ready for school. So, I've not been well recently and I've needed to book in to see the doctors. And I found myself at 8 o'clock in the morning while I'm making the kids breakfast, being on my phone, trying to do this
Yeah.
blooming
Yep.
form. And I can see my daughter watching me. And what I've tried to do there is to demystify the process and say, look, I appreciate I am on my phone at the minute. I don't want to be on my phone. And, we don't want to be on our phones when we're at the dinner table having breakfast. Um, and then explain about the doctors and stuff and show her the form and stuff. And it's really boring. So she doesn't care very quickly because
Yes.
it's a boring thing to see. But she gets why. And she understands that sometimes that boundary needs to be shifted a little bit because there's literally no other time in the day where we can do that. And it's, health's really important, and going to see the GP in this case is a really important thing to do. Versus, being on my phone to do the form, and she'll go, what, Daddy, what are you doing? And I go, oh, nothing, I'll be done in a minute, do it, and then put my phone away, and then there's no other conversation about it. To try and put myself in her shoes and imagine what that looks like,
Mhm.
without any information from me about what I'm doing on my phone, she's left to fill in the gaps, right? So is in one scenario it might be that, oh, Daddy likes his phone more than he likes me. In another scenario, it might be that these phone things that all the adults have got, they're really cool. I want to try one of those, and it feels like it's something that you shouldn't talk to people about because my dad's not talking about it. So
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm going to model that behavior when I get my phone. The point is, you don't know because no conversation is happening
Yeah.
there.
So
Whereas if you try and kind of keep it open and transparent and just demystify it, then at least everybody knows what's going on, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And my confession is I am totally guilty of doing well, there are certain phases throughout technology, like when the first mini iPad came out and I'd been off and bought it and I was sitting at home. My children were on their technology. So one was on the TV, one was on the computer, and I'm sitting there going, look at me doing my emails. That's great working. And I realized nobody had spoken for an hour. And
Mm.
I was like, okay, this can't happen. That then resulted in my doing a TEDx on this because I did it yet again when my children were adults, to which to which my eldest held me accountable on more than one occasion.
Yeah.
And there is this thing about so in training, I've got a couple of slides, and one of them is a woman in an airport because this picture went viral on social media, and it was a little baby on the floor and a mum using her smartphone. And the
Mm.
context behind the image is she'd finished breastfeeding the child now wanted to go to sleep, which is often the case. And she was now
Hmm.
texting her husband to say the plane's been delayed for a couple of hours. And that's what we're doing. We're taking those snapshot moments and going,
Yeah.
phone, bad, no communication for the family. The child's going
Yeah.
to da 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 da. And of course, in the work I do, it's generally around attachment and relational processes. We are now in a space where I do talk about the three-parent family, which is the mum, dad, and the thing, because
Mm.
the thing is ever present in many families. And
Yeah.
certainly, reading when I was reading your book in terms of the way that she would take off with your phone and run away with it, that made me laugh because that is just so toddler type in terms of, I know this is important to you, so I'm going to take it. Um,
Yeah.
there is something about we've got to be a little bit compassionate with ourselves that this
Yeah.
technology is here, and the example you've given is brilliant. And sometimes you have to do what you have to do via technology because most people and most services are now going to the digital space.
Yeah.
And certainly that explanation that you give your daughter is the thing that then reassures her value in the family. And what I tend to work with are the people who say, I don't understand what 2 minutes means. 2 minutes,
Mm.
just give me 2 minutes, just give me 2 minutes. Maybe, maybe, maybe. And Nothing. Nothing is the
Mhm.
phrase that gets used a lot by, and this is what children will say in the office is, my mum's always on her phone. She never pays attention to me, and I don't even know what she's doing because it's always nothing.
Mm. And it's really hard, right?
Yeah.
And I by no means am I perfect. Like, that I've developed lots of bad habits with my phone, as we all have. I've got some good ones as well, but I'm trying really hard to work on the bad ones. And the thing is that you don't get it right even when you're aware of them and you're trying to do something about them. You won't get it right every time because it's a habit and it's
Yes.
become
Yes.
automatic, right? And those things, it's not just a quick fix solution here. It's like trying to turn an oil tank around. It takes time and quite a lot of effort. And I
Yeah.
think you've got to be, like you say, you've got to be really compassionate with yourself during that process and sort of use each time you catch or don't catch yourself, or each time you catch yourself being on your phone when you don't want to be, when you've decided that that's a boundary condition for you, but you find yourself on it, and you find yourself saying, somebody asks you what you're doing on your phone, you say, "Oh, nothing, doesn't matter." Just trying to catch that,
Mhm.
and not necessarily in that moment stopping and going, "Okay, well, why did I say it that way?" But just trying to catch it. I
Yeah.
don't know if I've done it in this talk, but
It's certainly, yeah.
I
Well, there's. I'm going to put you on. I'm going to put you on a hotspot in just a second, but actually, that what are you doing on your phone? Nothing is a major problem between romantic relationships as well. So that's
Mhm.
just to say, I,
Yeah.
having an explanation. Oh, I'm just texting so and so, or I'm reading an article, or we do find ourselves like, oh, how dare you ask what I'm doing? This is my private And again, we need to get over ourselves on that one. Probably not the best thing to say as a
But I
therapist.
think but I think actually, like, a lot of the time, the reason that we say nothing or it doesn't matter is because actually what we were doing was not important. Like, we didn't need to be doing it. We were just doing something
Mhm.
unintentionally, like we were just having a flick through Instagram and we didn't need to, but we've developed that habit. And in saying, "Oh, nothing," we're sort of implicitly saying, actually,
There's no
I'm a bit
value.
embarrassed that that's what I was doing, and I don't really want to tell anybody
Yeah.
that's what. But again, just trying to be mindful of that and thinking, well, why was I doing that in that moment when I know myself that I didn't need to?
Mhm,
And how can I do something differently the next time I'm in that situation? Again, it's really hard and you won't
mhm.
get it right every time, but just try not to beat yourself too much up about it too much, and give yourself a bit of space to try and figure out what's working for you tech wise and what isn't, and just you know almost kind of like in an objective, being a bit of a robot about it, going, okay, well, this thing isn't working for me. Do I really need to be doing it? Can I get rid of it? And just experimenting with that
Okay.
sort of
So
thing.
this is the kind of hotspot question then. So I personally, and I fought particularly quite hard for the word habit to be on the book coming out,
Mm.
because I don't professionally believe in this word addiction when it comes to social media, because as we were saying earlier, in terms of the
Mm.
modus operandi, the environment that you're in, the process, the function,
Yeah.
in that moment that you've just talked about, really lovely there, is what am I doing this for? Is it serving me in this moment? So why do you think we've got this? And this is definitely with the delay smartphones, ban smartphones narrative at the moment, is they are so, in air quotes, addictive.
Mhm.
And why do you think we use that terminology? And I did want to say, actually, when you were talking about digital detoxes, which I sarcastically wrote about in my first book, what I can tell you with the medical research, because I spend a lot of time in that space, is detoxes do not work because of what your bodies do in terms of. So people who go off and do I don't know, a fruit or green juice detox or whatever, generally they will go back to their eating habits, and
Yeah.
sometimes and more.
Yeah.
So are we using the wrong nomenclature by using the word addiction in this space? That is a hotspot question.
So yeah, it's a great question. I think the answer is yes, and I think what's happening there or has happened is that there are various meanings of the word addiction, right? And
Hmm.
there is a common day-to-day usage of it, which is we say we're addicted to things when we mean that we really like them or they're fun. Sometimes we might mean it when we actually mean that, if you watch this show, it's really addictive. When you've watch, like you binge watch it, which again, binge watching is
Mhm.
part of this
Mhm.
sort of addictive way of thinking, this addiction terminology, that we've co-opted these sort of clinical definitions into day-to-day usage to mean completely different things.
Yeah.
Now, what I think happens is that we get we get into this sort of cyclical way of thinking that, researchers come along and go, everybody's saying that they're addicted to this thing. We should look at this within the framework of addiction, and then we get stuck in that framework. There's this inherent assumption that these things are addictive when there's not been any real concerted effort to try and take that apart
Yeah.
and try and
Yeah.
understand that in a better way. um, what you then do is end up focusing on, usually, but not exclusively, excessive use as the defining feature. And that's why we got into this whole debate around how much screen time is too much. Because you're trying to find, basically, you're trying to pinpoint the point
Mhm.
at
Mhm.
which, you know, 30 minutes of screen time a day is okay, but 31 minutes, you're in the
Yes.
bad territory then. And it kind of feeds into the digital detox and that sort of well-being um, industry. Again, it's very much grounded in addictive terminologies. And I think what happens is that when we use that sort of framing and phrasing, then we inevitably fall back on trying to look at this in terms of neurobiology.
Yeah.
Um, so we get into that state you were talking about very early on. This idea of, like, everybody talks about dopamine, the dopamine hit of going on social media, and it's just a complete misunderstanding of what dopamine is. And that's not to disparage anybody. Dopamine's super complicated, and I don't get most of what
Yeah.
dopamine does. I don't think any one person necessarily can. Dopamine is not a pleasure chemical, but that's how we characterize it. It does a lot of stuff, and it has a lot of varying, sometimes opposite effects. But what happened in the 1980s and onwards was that there was this thing called the dopamine theory of addiction, which really took hold. And even in the neuroscience literature, what you found was that there was this race to publish papers, essentially, where you take something that people say that they find pleasurable, stick them in a brain scanner, and see if it activates dopamine in the brain.
Mhm. Mhm.
Just to see whatever rewarding activity of the day is, can it be linked to dopamine? But what it's meant is that we've got into this frame of thinking, which is that um, if you enjoy something, then dopamine is involved because dopamine is a pleasure chemical. Dopamine is also involved in addiction. So that means that if you enjoy something, you can be addicted to it. If you enjoy something too much, there's the potential for addiction. Therefore, what we constantly are looking for is, what's the point? What's the danger point for this thing turning from enjoyable
Yeah.
to addictive? And I think, again, it's just the wrong way of thinking about particularly digital technologies.
Yeah.
It's not the right way of thinking about them. And certainly, there's a really great review from, it's nearly 10 years ago, actually, from David Nutt, who's very well established in neuropsychopharmacology.
Yes.
Basically saying that neuroscientists, good neuroscientists don't really consider dopamine as the sole basis of addiction anymore. Maybe for like some specific substances, but certainly when we're
Mhm.
talking about behavioral addictions, it's by no means is it the only part of the jigsaw. Um, but that's not been reflected in the public discourse. So you get stuff like scientists find that Oreos are as addictive as cocaine. Scientists find that power, wanting power,
Uh,
is as,
it
is as addictive as cocaine. Is a news article that I saw a while ago that it feels like it makes intuitive sense to think about these in terms of an addictive framework. But it's not the only framework to think about it. I think habit formation is
Mhm.
a much better way of thinking about it. B, I find it a very disempowering way of thinking about tech use in particular, because inevitably what tends to happen is that it's not just that they're addictive, phones are addictive. We say that they're addictive by design, that this is something that's intentionally happened to us deliberately, and we kind of we weren't aware that that was what was happening, and we're powerless to prevent it. And I find that a very disempowering message,
Oh, it's
because
victim
it
blaming.
makes you feel
Yeah.
like, well, I can't do anything about this. And the solutions that it leaves you with are abstinence, basically,
Or banning. Well,
getting rid
this
of
is
the
where,
tech or
yeah,
banning.
this is where
Yeah,
the anger
and
is.
we know that they don't work. Those sorts
Mhm.
of solutions don't work. Whereas thinking about tech use in terms of habit formation, habits are neutral. Habits are not inherently good or inherently bad. It's other things around that habit formation that might turn it into a good or a bad thing. So the kind of
Mm.
silliest thing, not silly, but the most straightforward example that I could think of, which is one that I use in the book, is phone checking. Like picking up your phone to check for messages is a habit that you can form. And it's probably the first one that we all form when we get phones. Certainly nowadays it is. Not good or bad for us.
Mhm.
It's just a thing, right? The more you do it, um, again, just the sheer frequency of it is not necessarily a good or bad thing. But the more you do it in a way that you don't think about it in terms of intentionality, or a way in terms of thinking about it in terms of how it aligns with your goals or not, then the more likely it is you're going to do it in a situation where it leads to a bad outcome.
Yeah.
So checking your phone at night when you're at home and you're feeling really lonely and you want to talk to your mates, good thing, good for well-being, good
Yes.
habit to get into. Checking your phone just because you want to see what somebody might have put on Twitter, because you've not checked for 20 minutes while you're driving down the road, really
Not
bad habit to get
good.
into. Really,
Yeah.
but is a habit that people will get into and do
Yeah.
get into. So really bad habit. Um, the habit itself, the thing that you're doing, checking, is not the bad thing. It's other things around it that potentially lead to harm or maladaptive behaviors or problematic habit formation. Um, Habits are things that you can change, right? They're
Yeah.
really not, they're not easy to change at all. We are literally, we are creatures of habit, but you
Well,
can
that's why
change them.
therapy exists.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
If
and
people could change. Yeah.
we do this. We form habits literally in terms of everything and anything that we do. But again, the first step to changing them is to noticing them and being aware of them. And I think we
Mhm.
could all be, sort of an ironic thing that I say in the book, that a good tech habit that we all need to better develop is getting into that habit of just checking in with ourselves every so often and going, what's working for me, what's not. And when you start thinking in that sort of way, the solution is not get rid of phone or get rid of social media. It might be, in some cases, that might be the thing that ultimately you decide is the right thing for you, and if so, great. But I think in the majority of cases, we'll realize that actually our phones, or social media or whatever, we get good
Mhm. Mhm.
stuff out of some aspects of it, and there are other things that we don't. So how do we remove those bad bits and keep the good?
I loved what you said about what works for you, and the reason I want to kind of, and I'm going to do a term here that gets used on all podcasts. So now I feel like I'm in the crowd. Let's double click on that. In terms of that terminology makes me laugh that we're all using kind of computer based language to talk about. Let's zoom in on this. It's incredible how that's become part of our everyday language. But the what works for you. So this is definitely something that happens in the clinical all the time when I'm talking to somebody. I happen to follow certain things in my life, which is incredibly interesting because one of my trackers will say, "Did you read a non-screen in bed last night?" And
Mm,
nearly every night I look at it and I go, "No," because like we were talking earlier, no, I go to bed to go to sleep. But
mhm,
we're in a space where the internet is full of hacks and resolutions and just do this and just do that. Actually, you have to do it individually.
yeah.
And pretty much that's where I'm kind of coming from, because the bit that I see that doesn't get talked about in this space is, whilst we're talking about the dopamine hits and everything like that, you've actually alluded to this in your conversation. What we do with social media, clues in the title, is relational. And we are
Mhm,
on social media because we're socializing. And unfortunately, I think there's a very large documentary that talked about this race to the bottom of the brainstem, which makes it sound like we're helpless, we're a victim, technology has done this to us, we don't have a choice, and we have so disempowered
yeah.
and blamed the public that actually what I think is happening at the moment, and certainly for me, this is in the podcasting space, is we're becoming saturated. I think we're now
Mm.
reaching a point where we're like, what am I doing? What am I doing? And why am I doing it so often? And I think one of the young people in my clinic said, I know that I'm doom scrolling, using the language that they use.
Yeah.
I know I'm doom scrolling, but actually I've got nothing else to do. And
Mm.
I go, well, how can you change that? Because it's not about me saying, well, do this, do that, or do the other. It's getting a person to think about their own empowered choices. And
Yeah.
that's the only way we can think about this rather than banning stuff.
Mm.
Because it's, for me, there's something about what powers do you have? What can you do in this situation? And
Yeah.
that's the same for people in coercive relationships, bad jobs. You know, that's the whole crux of therapy is I don't tell people what to do. I help them work it out for themselves. So pretty
You
much that's
can't tell people what to
no,
do, right?
no.
Because you don't do it. Yeah. Yeah, you've got to want
Yeah.
to change for yourself, and
Hmm.
you've got to want to figure out what the thing is that will work for you.
Mm,
And that's one of the hardest things, right? Is just taking those first steps. Um, but yeah, they can be done. You know, it's and this is one of the things that I talk about towards the end of the book is sort of a weirdly become for being a very pro evidence person. I sort of weirdly become non-evidence based towards the end because in the sleep chapter I say that we look at the research evidence for night shift mode because
mhm.
the theory goes there that if blue light is impacting sleep, if you kind of reduce the amount of blue light that's coming out of your screens, which is basically what night shift mode suggests to do, which is sort of turn the screen yellow, then that should work. And the weird thing in that research area is that there's no research evidence to suggest that it works. There's not been many studies done on it, but most of them don't really show any effect. But then, so the take home message there is like night shift mode doesn't work, so there's no point in using it. But at the end of the book, I basically say if you like night shift mode, put it on. So I used to do this. I do it less so now. But until like relatively recently, I did have night shift mode on my phone, and it's not because I thought it was helping my biology or anything like that. It's because I spotted it. Right? It's you're on your phone and you notice it going yellow, and then that's a way of catching yourself in the moment and going, "Oh, hang on, it's got to this time in the evening now. It's almost like a little alarm,
Yeah.
basically. Maybe it's time to go to bed now."
Actually, it is
And if that
evidence.
works for you, great, do
Yeah,
it.
it is evidence-based though, Pete. What you're talking about is either placebo or nocebo, which
Hmm.
is a thing. So I mean, yes, I have the night shift on, mainly because when it's bright, it hurts my eyes. It makes me squint.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's my reason for using the night shift. But I've seen, again, these are the hacks that I see online in terms of turn you can put color filters on. You can turn it to red
Yeah.
because it's easier to see red. And I did hear this is again pop crap bullshit science. That in so when my eldest son was in the army, he was texting me in one of the lectures, and he said, "We've just been told that if somebody turns their Facebook profile to black and white, it's a sign of depression and impending suicide." And I went, "Oh wow, that's not slightly exaggerated." But I know some people who like to turn the colours from their phone. I'm like, what works for you? I happen to use a piece of software that dims the colours on my monitor because, again, my eyes are strained and I am slightly older
Yeah.
now. So I choose to do that so that I'm not kind of looking like I don't know, like I've got constipation or whatever when I'm staring at the screen. So I choose to do things for my own benefit.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about habits, the one thing that cropped up is and I find this incredible in the podcast space as well. So you've got what I call the big bro bromances at the top. And they go, a morning routine is what you should be doing. But they don't call that a habit or anything to worry about because it's not a habit as far as they're concerned. It's a morning
Mm.
routine. But if you
Hmm.
pick your phone up, that's an addiction.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's incredibly hypocritical.
I think it's just a lack of awareness in a way that we've all fallen very easily into that frame of thinking about it's not just phones and social media. It's all digital tech. That this is not the first time that we've had this conversation around, is a particular form of tech addictive or not. As long as these things have been around, we've been worried about them. There was a debate in the Houses of Parliament in 1981 about whether Space Invaders was addictive or not.
Yeah.
Um, and it was nearly regulated, right? It was a pretty close call on the vote that this thing was going to be regulated. And the argument there was that, teenagers are like bunking off school and they're stealing and breaking into people's houses to get money to feed their Space Invaders addiction, because they want to go down to the arcade and just feed money into these arcade machines, and they're zombie like, and it's killing them basically.
Mm.
I
That's
mean,
the youth, though, isn't it? The older people always blame the youth for. Look at them doing their thing that we don't understand.
I think there is a sort of generation gap here that things that you grow up with are things that you grow up with, right? So it's not to say that they're all fine and hunky dory, but you tend to be a little bit more aware of navigating the good aspects versus the bad. And then as you get older, things come along that you just don't have time to get to grips with, right? And I think we tend to, as we get older, view new forms of technology, new stuff. I mean, it's not even technology; you see it in all. I don't like
Yeah,
music that's come out over the past 3 years. I just don't think is as good as the music that I liked when I were a lad, and that's true of literally every generation. Right, we've been complaining for
yeah,
literally decades and decades that new music is not as good as what it used to be, and it's the same with digital technology, right? That new stuff comes out and you maybe don't have the time or the interest anymore to get to grips with it, and therefore you don't understand it, and therefore you view it, understandably, you view it with caution. You see that the
yeah,
generations that are getting to grips with it are the kids, so you then worry about the effects on the kids, and it's a
yeah.
tale as old as time.
Well, that's why they've come up with their own language, and they go, yeah, okay, boomer. That's it. It's kind of like, yeah, you're over yonder in the years gone past, and we're
Mhm.
here, we're in the moment. And whilst I know that young people are certainly saying, yes, I've noticed I've got a problem with it, and they do use the word addiction, actually young
Mhm.
people are more aware of what they do with technology than me being nearly a boomer. Even though
Mhm.
the children get my generation wrong, clearly there's something I need to do with my facial routine, because they do call me boomer a lot. Is
But
there
yeah,
is
sorry,
there
go on.
anything you wanted to? I'm just looking at the time, Pete, in terms of we've been yabbering for about an hour and a half now. Is there anything you want people to kind of think about? Or, I mean, definitely it's go pick up, and you can get it on audio for the people that like to listen on
Yeah.
audio. Um, Certainly it is a book that I consumed rapidly rather than the hype one, which I struggled like heck to read, because I kept putting it down after having like
Mm.
and just wandering off like, where is the evidence of this? Um, is there anything you want people to know or think about, and just the conversation that we've had?
I think for me, I think pretty much the last thing that I say in the book is that one of the things that we could all be better at doing is not just um, uncritically, sort of passively taking in stuff that we hear about technology effects in the news. And I guess it's true of any sort of news, really. That I think we said this really close to the start of this conversation, that we're really good at being super critical of stuff that doesn't fit with our worldview.
Hmm.
And we're really bad at the opposite. Anything that fits with our worldview, we just take in as a given, and it's totally understandable why we do that. It's like a core feature of being a human, right? That sort of ego protection, in a way. But I think we need to get better at that if what we're talking about is regulations or policies that could have quite wide-ranging, far-reaching impacts on society. That we need to be better critical thinking and critical analysis, and not just assume that our view is the correct one. So the thing that I say at the end of the book is, we need to be better at this, and you basically take stuff with a pinch of salt that people tell you, and that goes for everything that I've written in the book as well. I'm not saying actually ignore what everybody else is saying. My book is right. We need to critically interrogate all of this sort of stuff to come to the right sorts of decisions. Really.
Can I
So
do
I would say that, and the other thing, sorry, just the
go
other
on.
thing that I'd say is that it would be. I know this is maybe a bit naive of me to say, but I think we could be a bit kinder in this space around the conversations that we
Yeah.
have with each other online. I mean, obviously, online's it's a nightmare, but um, it is an emotionally reactive topic, right? And understandably so. And this is something that deeply worries a lot of parents and
Yeah.
caregivers and teachers and everybody. But we will get further with the best sorts of solutions if we just have a bit more empathy in the process.
Can I reflect that actually in your book, and I would say yours is a book to read and actually understand and take the evidence from, because the evidence that I mean, the same as when I was doing the book, the yellow one that'll come out later on,
Mhm.
going and reading through that evidence, there is something about trustworthiness of academics who are putting this information out there, and certainly with your book, you have provided the evidence and places. So the point I'm making here is one of the things I see in this space is it's not necessarily the critical thinking, which we bash out of children very early on, like stop asking the why question. But
Mm.
actually, people are not going back to the source. And I find this incredibly funny with the documentary that quotes E.O. Wilson right at the very beginning, but clearly hasn't read E.O. Wilson from beginning to
Mm.
end to really sit and think about what is it that E.O. Wilson was actually talking about in terms of human beings.
Yeah.
And the evidence that you provide is much more nuanced around a large number of topics rather than arbitrary opinions, which seem to be in a lot of other books. So I do want to make the point, Pete, that actually your book is really, really evidenced and balanced versus some of those that are out there that are anecdotal op-eds and based in moralistic grandiosity.
Well, it's very kind of you. Thank you.
I'm not so much not so much kind. I know that you were talking about that, but factual. And I have to read. It's like, I think I might have quoted this in the book. It's like reading treacle at times. I look and I go, I don't
Mm.
understand what's going on here. Then I go off and find myself on a tangent looking up at about how certain regression analyses are conducted and what that actually means, to find myself even more quagmired in terms of what am I what am I trying to understand here. But
Mm.
again, I did mention it earlier, there are large bodies of evidence that are saying, here are, for example, the ledger of harms. And in those harms, and this goes back to one of my favourite studies that I quoted, there was a piece of research done on the impact of using social media and memory. Okay, so memory being a large construct itself. And wouldn't you know, the older people had problems with their memory that they were interviewing. And I thought, so how's this a ledger of harm about social media when actually what you're
Mm.
studying is memory, and memory
Yeah.
is infallible and it changes with age. That is incontestable in terms of we know that. And what did you factor in for? And that piece of research is now sitting on a website saying social media makes you unable to remember anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and that's the great difficulty of communicating the science around this, right?
hmm
It's trying to
hmm
figure out um, how you counter situations like that because they happen a lot, but do it in a way where you don't end up getting lost in the detail in terms of your final message as well. And it's really not easy to do. It's
yeah.
really hard.
So what we're really saying is this is complicated, multifaceted, complex, even though I have said complicated and complex and they are slightly different. And this is about being humans. And it goes back to the very first thing you said. What goes on in here, pointing at your head?
Mm.
Well, I'm going to say and bodies as well. What goes on for us is individual as well as
Yeah,
collective. And what we're tending to do is look at smaller versions of maybe individuals and say, well, that must apply to everybody. So
yeah.
really do your own research, even though that's a glib sentence from many years ago on a chat forum, which I won't mention. Okay. Thank you for your time, Pete. Where can people find you? Podcasting language. We'll put them in the show notes. But
That's
there is
very
something
kind of
about
you. Thank you.
you're on lots of social media, aren't you?
I am. Yeah, I'm in most places. I think usually I'm on at Pete Etchells. So I'm on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn and places like that. I have a website, which is peteetchells.com. If you want to get in touch with me, you
Mhm.
can through there. And it's got links to my book and other things
Perfect.
there.
And we'll make sure that everybody knows about both books, because it isn't just the most recent. I think The Lost in a Good Game is one of those books that sits on my shelves alongside Moral Combat and a few of the others by like Coa and Quant. And yeah,
Mm.
there's a whole set of my the people I look up to in this space, and I need a bigger bookshelf actually. So that's good
Esteemed
because
company to be in.
it's as far as I'm concerned, it's beginning. And one of the things I said in my book actually is there's more research on broccoli and sulforaphane than there is on technology and young people.
Mm.
That's
Yeah.
got to change. And it is.
Yeah.
It is. But thank you very much for the
Thank you for having me.
conversation. Okay.